Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to IRMS Public Sector's September event. First of all, can I just check that people can hear me? Because we're having terrible problems with sound this morning. Fortunately, thank you very much. That's fine. You will all be able to hear the speaker. We can hear him. Thank you. That's perfect. Thank you. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Robert Bath, who is going to present on Microsoft 365. Just a few housekeeping notes. Could you please put your questions in the question tab if you have access to it, so that we can deal with the questions at the end? And if you would like to use the chat, please feel free to put any comments or questions that you have of one another in the chat. Obviously, we like to stay polite and constructive, but I know I don't need to tell everybody that. So I'm just about to tell Robert I'm going to hand over to him, because Robert can't hear me at the moment. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to Robert.
Well, I'm going to brave starting to talk. Can anyone hear me? Because I can't hear anything that's going on.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Yes, yeah.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about this slightly odd introduction to a session. For some reason, I think everyone can hear each other except for me. I'm unable to hear Elizabeth. So I don't know if it's just Elizabeth. It's probably my headphones that are playing up. But anyway, very odd start to a session. Let me switch over my screen and hopefully we'll be able to see the slides. Of course, no one will be able to tell me if we can't anyway. But for those of you who don't know me, my name is Robert Bath. I'm a Microsoft 365 solution architect, and I focus very heavily on compliance and retention inside Microsoft 365. So almost, I'm hoping that I'm speaking to an audience where that's a relevant set of material to sort of be covering today. I also, for those of you who know me, happen to be the IRMS's digital director, so helping the IRMS with lots of different things, including the IRMS's own transition into Microsoft 365. So at any stage, feel free to reach out, get in contact with me, have a chat if you want to, or raise any questions you've got. Now, in today's session, what I want to be talking about is effectively, there's inside Microsoft 365, you've got retention capabilities, as I'm sure many of you are very well aware. And I want to really sort of provide a quick overview of those retention capabilities so that we can get into discussing some of the more recent updates that Microsoft has introduced to them, because I think some of those updates to the retention capabilities are really quite interesting and really can change the way that we use Microsoft 365. So I'm going to keep skipping back just to see if anyone's asking questions or anything. But I'm hoping this all works out, given the technical issues at the start of this session. Right, so I don't think I really need to explain retention as a concept to the audience that I've got on this call. It's, to use a really bad analogy, it's effectively sorting the wheat from the chaff. So what I want to do is I keep skipping back, by the way, I'm on one screen. I keep skipping back just to see whether I'm sharing the right content. But within Microsoft 365, it's very important, obviously, that now that all of our content started to be moved across and more organizations are using Microsoft 365 as almost the cornerstone of their content management within the organization, it's really important that we find mechanisms to allow us to make sure that the content that we need to keep is retained and isn't accidentally deleted. And at the same time, the content that we absolutely just shouldn't be keeping and need to get rid of is deleted on a timely basis. And this is where the retention capabilities that I'm sure many of you already are using and already are quite familiar with within Microsoft 365 are absolutely your best friends when it comes to protecting the quality of the information that you've got inside your environments. And I don't need to introduce them. The two capabilities that primarily Microsoft 365's retention story revolves around are, I think Graham Snow once described them as the gruesome twosome, but retention policies and retention labels. Now, I'll go into a little bit of detail in a second about quite what these two are for anyone who's joined this call who's not familiar with retention policies and retention labels. But what I really want to focus today's presentation on is discussing some of the recent changes that Microsoft has introduced. So specifically, I'll be looking at the new, or relatively, it's about to be launched fairly soon, I hope, adaptive scopes for retention policies. It was announced back in May. And for retention labels, I really want to look at the concept of multi-stage disposition, which was launched in May, and so many of you are already using it. And also the change that Microsoft snuck in only a few weeks ago, back in August, switching the way that retention labels work inside SharePoint. So let's start just with an introduction or an overview of retention policies and retention labels. So at a very high level, retention policies are your broad brush approach to retention in Microsoft 365. They provide you with a really quite intuitive and simple way of painting a very wide area of Microsoft 365 with almost a blanket retention. So you've got the ability to set up a number of different retention policies in your tenancy, give them different names, and you can associate each. You need to associate each with a duration for retention and also an activity at the end of retention. With retention policies, you have two activities at the end of retention. You either choose to destroy your content or nothing happens. Come on to that in a bit. The way that retention policies work is you effectively pick a large container in Microsoft 365, and the retention policy gets applied to that container. Now, at its broadest level, you could pick, for example, the whole of OneDrive and say every individual site or account, I think Microsoft calls them, in OneDrive that gets created, apply the same retention policy to all of them. But the lowest level of granularity you can go to is, for example, to say, apply a single retention policy to an entire inbox. So all of the emails in that inbox are subject to the same retention policy and therefore the same retention duration and the same activity at the end of retention. You could do the same to an entire SharePoint site, or let's say all of the channel conversations that occur in a single team, for example. So the best way to think about them is they're quite broad in their application. They're also they're simple to set up, and they're really quite powerful when used, but they don't have all of the sort of more advanced features that retention labels offer. So jumping into retention labels are almost the opposite end of that same story. Retention labels, instead of being applied at a broad brush approach, the way Microsoft's defined them is almost that they apply on each individual item. So every individual record is manually classified with a retention label. I say manually, they can all be manually overridden. There's other ways of applying retention labels. So with retention labels, typically you set up a much broader file plan. It's closer to a large-scale file plan. I wouldn't recommend creating a full sort of, you can't tier them like you can in a file plan. So you can't have almost activity function sub, you can't do that sort of hierarchy. But what this tends to mean is it's almost like a cut down overview of your file plan that you're building in retention labels. But there's certainly more retention label. Typically, when you're creating an architecture of retention labels, you'll create a lot more of them in most scenarios than you would ever with retention policies. And again, with each, you create them with a retention duration and an activity at the end of retention. There's a few differences in those activities. But one of the primary differences with retention labels is you start grouping them up into groupings that Microsoft has confusingly decided to call the label policies. Now, those label policies, or I call them retention label policies, shouldn't be confused with either retention labels or retention policies. Label policies are just a grouping of retention labels that allow you to push an individual grouping out to a specific part of Microsoft 365. So to explain, let's just take this one SharePoint site here, this Office Refurb site, and forget all of the other noise that we've got there. What we're seeing here is just these two retention labels have been added to this hypothetical projects label policy grouping. and then the Office refurb site has been associated with that label policy. What that does is those two retention labels will now be available inside the Office refurb SharePoint site, so that users can choose to apply those two retention labels. They don't see all of the other retention labels that you've got available inside this site. They only see the ones that have actually been pushed out to the given site. And this makes it more intuitive for the users because they don't have to pick from your entire file plan. They pick from the relevant parts of your file plan that have been pushed to the given space that they're currently working in. So at a very high level then, there are fundamental differences between retention policies and retention labels. And I'm just going to skip back just in case there's anything critical going on in the comments. Nothing that I can see, but do feel free to add comments and questions. I can't see them at this time. I can respond to the questions at the end of the presentation. But at a high level, retention policies are applied with this very broad brush approach, for example, to all of the content in a site, whereas retention labels, typically you push them out, you associate them with the site, and then users can choose to manually apply them. But you've also got other methods of applying retention labels. You can set default values on libraries and folders. You can also automatically assign retention labels. There's a number of different ways in Microsoft 365 of automatically assigning retention labels, including you've got an ability to use something called trainable classifiers, which is machine learning effectively that's starting to identify a type of content, and every time let's say it's a policy, every time it sees something that it thinks is a policy, it will automatically apply that retention label to it. You've also got something called a sensitive information type, which basically is advanced pattern matching. So for example, finding all of the files that contain, I don't know, a credit card number or a passport number and automatically applying retention labels at scale that way. You can also pick up any combination of SharePoint metadata or keywords that happen to be in files and use that sort of, you build up a query and that can almost allow you to apply retention labels based upon the way the content inside files and also the way that files have been classified with SharePoint metadata. And if you're lucky enough, you've also got SharePoint syntax, which almost can scan. I guess it's probably best to say fairly consistent files and start extracting metadata automatically from inside those files. And SharePoint syntax can also be used to automatically apply retention labels to content. Now, during the retention period, you can start the retention period with a retention policy based on when the item was first created. So it could be X months after first created, or X months after last created, last modified, for example. That's after the file's last been changed or modified. But with retention labels, you've got more options. You can also trigger the start of retention, for example, based on when an item was first labeled, or when the label was applied to the item, which I find really useful in scenarios such as when a records manager wants to have a retention period that starts when a file is superseded by another file. So, for example, you could almost have an indefinite retention label that's applied to a permanent retention label, let's say, applied to the file that you then supersede. And when you change that label and apply a different label, you can potentially use the label event, the unlabeled trigger becomes a really effective way to start that sort of retention off. And last but not least is event-based retention. Now, event-based retention is really, really powerful. It allows you to trigger the start of a retention period almost around an activity that's happening inside your organization. So I used it to great effect with one organization earlier this year to allow retention on multiple retention labels to be triggered, let's say at the start of a calendar year or at the end of the financial year. But you could imagine how it could be based on a specific project closing or a property being sold. You know, whatever the triggers are inside your organization, you can, in theory, use those triggers to trigger an event that causes all of the retention periods that needs to start from that event to sort of be invoked automatically. So that's pretty cool. During the retention period, with a retention policy, the file, the content, effectively, it's still mutable. You can still users can carry on and change that content. They can also delete the file, but what happens with the retention policy is it's caught behind the scenes. Now with a retention label, you've got an option whether you want to allow the file to be changed or whether or not you want to make it immutable. Now, effectively, Microsoft call this the record label. There's actually multiple different types of retention labels, just to slightly confuse, muddy the water, but they're variants really. The retention label has a variant called the record label, and another slightly scarier, if you ask me, variant that permanently locks things called the regulatory record label. And these will both make anything that the record label is applied to immutable. You notice here you've also got the ability with the retention label to delete files. Now, I'll come to this in a second because many of you will probably be going, hang on, I didn't think that was the case. But we'll come to this at the end of the presentation because this is one of the recent changes that Microsoft has introduced. Now, at the end of retention, with the retention policy, you've got two options, as I mentioned before. You can either cause the retention policy to delete the item, delete the record, or it does nothing, which is slightly better than it sounds. What it actually does is it allows, it basically means that when an end user clicks delete or anyone else clicks delete on that file, instead of the retention policy applying, it will actually delete it down from that date onwards. So if they delete it during the retention period, it will catch it in a hidden place behind the scenes. But if they delete it after the retention period, it will effectively allow it to continue to be deleted down. With a retention label, you've got an extra option. You've got both those two options, but you've also got the ability to invoke a disposition review. So as you can probably see, retention labels have significantly more functionality or potential than retention policies. That said, you really want a composition of both. The big benefit of retention policies is that they have a much broader reach across Microsoft 365. So you can apply retention policies in parts of Microsoft 365 that retention labels just can't be applied to. For example, Yammer. Now, the items that I'm highlighting in green, pretty much these all make up the main differences between the retention labels and the retention policies, all of the nice to haves. Unfortunately, all of these pretty much all of them require a premium license to be able to apply. So by premium, I'm talking E5 for all users, or one of the E3 information compliance bolt-on licenses that Microsoft provides. So you can't do this with the standard E3 license. Everything else that's in white is standard E3. So it's a bit frustrating that much of the advanced capability is hidden behind that sort of extra licensing uptick. But certainly if you want to allow content to be made immutable or undertake disposition reviews, you really need to be looking at retention labels with a premium license for all users. When I say all users, it's all users who have the ability to modify, apply the label, so edit the file in any space where those labels are available to apply. So pretty much all users for shorthand. Quite frustrating. Anyway, that was a quick overview of the background of what are retention labels and what are retention policies. What I want to jump into now is just starting to look at the first of these new changes. This one's still in the pipeline, but adaptive scopes. Now, I'm quite excited by adaptive scopes. Adaptive scopes, as you can probably see, if I just take you back to this slide that we had up before, just to remind you that we're talking about retention policies, not retention labels when it comes to adaptive scopes. So adaptive scopes are a new way of applying retention policies to content. If you can, let's try and simplify this story so that instead of having all this clutter on the page, I just want to zoom right in and just focus on one scenario. So as you can probably see at the bottom corner of the page now, I'm just going to check the comments to make sure I am still displaying my page correctly. Bear with me. Can't see any chat or questions yet. Oh, there's a couple of questions coming on. I'll answer those in a second towards the end of the presentation if you don't mind. But do feel free to have a chat if you want in the chat at the same time. But I hope I'm still presenting. Anyway, the exchange, you can see at the bottom there. You can see that we have, in the previous example, we applied the financial retention policy across Lara. Now, in order to do that with the standard retention policy, what you'd have to do is almost identify the people that you want to apply the retention policy to. And that really means identifying named individuals. You'd have to somehow know that you wanted to apply a specific retention policy to Lara's inbox, but not apply it to Nadia or Ben's. And to do that, really, with the retention policies, you need to identify all of the people that you want to apply a given retention policy to. Sure, you can have a flat one-size-fits-all approach where you're applying the same retention policy to all members of staff, or all students, or whatever it happens to be. But in most scenarios, you're needing to identify every individual that you want to apply a specific retention policy to. But the thing is with adaptive scopes is they recognize that we actually know an awful lot more about these individuals because of the metadata that's almost held behind the scenes. We can make use of that metadata to start thinking about a better way or a cleverer way of applying retention policies. So if you think about it, you've got bits of metadata held against people, such as in Azure Active Directory, you'll likely have your office and department populated. Now, I know there's probably people thinking, yeah, I know, but my Azure Active Directory is in a right state. And to that, I'd say, yeah, most organizations think that their Azure Active Directory is in a bit of a state. And probably for the last decade or more, you've had consultants come in and say, you really need to tidy that up. And honestly, I recognize that it's a huge undertaking for most organizations, but it really is worth considering, certainly at a high level, certainly some of the key fields, trying to actually get them as accurate as you can. Because just in this, not just for adaptive scopes, that's useful generally for almost anything. I would suggest any IT systems integration with users. But in this scenario, you can almost imagine how some of that metadata that we're storing, some of the information, the attributes, if you like, that we're storing against these people is useful to potentially allow us to apply retention policies. So specifically, I'm looking at that payroll attribute that we've got against Lara. And we could set up a adaptive scope-based retention policy so that it will automatically apply not just to the individual Lara, but to all users who happen to have a department that is payroll. So you can probably imagine that if we set up an adaptive scope to push out the retention policy, what it would do is it would automatically find Lara and apply that retention policy to her because she's in the payroll department. But the net effect might be the same, but it actually works in a slightly cleverer way than a standard retention policy, because not only do we not have to identify all of the people who happen to be in payroll and name them individually when we're setting up the retention policy, we've also got the ability for the retention policy to sort of change its scope so that whoever, different people joining or leaving the payroll department will be added to the retention policy automatically. So you could probably imagine if Ben here leaves the legal team and joins the payroll team, the same retention policy would automatically apply without any configuration needed because of the adaptive nature of the scope of how it's been set up. So I think adaptive scopes really take that retention policy concept and take it forward a long way to make it really dynamic, really flexible to use. And to me, it's quite exciting. To me, it makes the retention policy a powerful tool, I think, again. Now, as you can probably imagine, each user isn't just limited. The only things we know about them aren't limited to just department and office. There's a whole bunch of attributes that potentially we could get our hands on, like, for example, job title. I want to apply a retention policy to, I don't know, all of the nuclear scientists in my organization, or whatever it happens to be. Everyone whose name begins with an A. You can imagine the flexibility of this sort of approach. I can't imagine anyone needing a retention policy for people beginning with A, but you get the idea. There's a lot of different properties against each user that potentially we could hook into to create a adaptive scope-based retention policy. And by default, you've seen that it can apply to the whole of the inbox of any individual who meets the sort of the query that you set up when you're setting up the adaptive scope. But it doesn't just work for Outlook and for emails. It will also work against a whole bunch of other parts of Microsoft 365, from the personal chats you're having in Microsoft Teams to the individual messages you're sending out, the user messages in Yammer. And of course, you've got each individual also has a OneDrive account as well, with all of their personal content in. You could use these same user attributes to drive the application, automatic application of a retention policy through an adaptive scope to any of these spaces. But users aren't the only things, the only entities, if you like, inside a tenancy that have attributes. SharePoint sites also have attributes. You've got your site name and URL, and more interestingly, you've also got this thing called a property tag, which anyone who's gone deep into SharePoint in the past might have come across, but effectively it allows you to apply metadata at a site level. And this, of course, allows us to apply, you make use of site attributes to use the adaptive scope to apply a retention policy to, say, all of the SharePoint sites that happen to have been tagged in the property bag with a certain bit of metadata. Let's say legal team, or all of the SharePoint sites or OneDrive accounts that happen to have a certain name in their URL. Because of course you could potentially have naming conventions. And sites aren't the only thing. You've also got Microsoft 365 group model, where you've got the group name and the group email address, etc., and potentially any aliases you've given to the group. And this gives you the ability to apply the same principles to, say, channel messages or community messages. So it's really quite powerful in many ways. I'm just going to leave this slide up for a second or two in case anyone wants to grab a screenshot, because I think it's quite useful just to get an overview of the scope, if you like, of adaptive scopes. Obviously, I can provide the deck at the end as well to anyone who wants it. Right, moving on. Multi-stage disposition. Now, multi-stage disposition, this is where we jump ship and we're looking now at retention labels again. So this is the individual tagging of retention to individual files. Now, with multi-stage disposition, this is something that's live. It was released in May. So if you're using retention labels in Microsoft 365, you are already using multi-stage disposition to a greater or lesser extent. So I think it's useful to get your head around what that means if you haven't already done so. Now, I'm really excited by multi-stage disposition. I'll be honest, I think it's a really powerful addition to the Microsoft 365 suite. Something that I've been asking for a long time as well. Now, imagine your Microsoft 365 environment. Imagine what you're looking at here is lots of different workloads, places in SharePoint, places inside Teams, places in Outlook, different spaces, and you've got your records scattered all across different locations because, of course, the retention capabilities in Microsoft 365 are all in place. They're all retaining that information in wherever it's created by default, because that's where you're applying the retention to the content, unless you're doing something custom and moving files around to different locations. You can imagine you're going to have something like this in your tenancy. And what we've had up until now is that in the compliance center, you've got almost a central disposition area, which shows you all of the items that are pending disposition. And I should remind you that because this multi-stage disposition is making use of the disposition review, and the disposition review is a premium feature, everything I'm talking about here in multi-stage disposition requires, unfortunately, the premium licenses to be able to make use of, by the way. But up until now, you've got one great big sort of central pending dispositions list where all of the records from all of the different workloads are surfaced. They're not moved there, it's just sort of a search-based list that shows you all of the items that have reached the end of retention and now are subject to review. And what this has allowed up till now is a single central group of reviewers to be created who manage all of the dispositions from across the whole tenancy for your whole organization. And effectively, this group of reviewers, their options are to relabel content. What this means is you were picking a different retention label and saying, no, actually apply this one for instead. And you're swapping the existing retention label for the old for a new one. And whatever retention rules have been defined for the new one will then kick in and take over, and the old one's no longer relevant. So effectively, it sort of goes off in a completely different direction and could extend retention. You've also got an option to extend retention without changing the label. And what this means is you're effectively postponing the decision. So you're adding, let's say, 12 months or 24 months, and you're just saying, just disappear from this pending dispositions list for now, to an individual item or selected group of items, and come back in a year's time, because actually right now I can't make a decision about these items, but I know that in a year's time it's more likely that I'm going to be able to. So it's basically just sort of stalling that process and adding time to the existing retention. And lastly, you've got the option to dispose of any items, and this will, if you choose to dispose, will automatically start a process that invokes deletion. But with multi-stage disposition, what you've got is the same options, but effectively, instead of it just being, as the name suggests, a single stage, you can have up to 5 sequential stages of disposition review. And as you can imagine, content will move from stage to stage and go through different groups of reviewers. Now, I'll be honest, it's a little bit sort of limited at the moment, this multi-stage disposition review, in terms of we can't configure it too much. It's a little bit locked down. And let me just try and explain some examples of why I feel it's a little bit limited. Things such as the options that allow you to move between stages can't be configured. So imagine you choose to either relabel at any of these stages. Imagine you choose to relabel or extend. What happens in multi-stage disposition is that would stop the process there. So if the first group of reviewers, let's say, relabels and applies a completely different retention label to that given item, that record will not move to the second stage. It will just stop at the first stage and effectively, come back later when the new label kicks in. Same with extending. It stops the retention. It will not pass it to any subsequent stages. And these kick in not just at the first stage of multi-stage disposition, it kicks in at any stage of multi-stage disposition. So if you're in the second, third, fourth stage, and you choose to stop the process by relabeling or extending, that's it. It will not move through to the subsequent reviewers. The only way, therefore, to pass records through multi-stage disposition is by choosing to dispose. You can probably imagine that it doesn't make sense for the first person to say, I want to dispose this, because what it does there is it doesn't automatically delete the file at that stage. What it's doing is it's passing the record to the next group of reviewers. And again, if they choose to dispose of that item, it will carry on passing it through the chain. But actually, the item isn't automatically deleted until the very last group of reviewers chooses to dispose of that given item. Now, I say the last group of reviewers because, of course, you don't have to have 5 stages. If you've only got 1 stage, that last group of reviewers might be the very first stage in this multi-stage disposition. If you've got 3 groups of reviewers, it would be that third group. And when they choose to dispose, that is when the item starts going through the deletion process. So it's important to just understand that at the moment, I'm hoping it gets more flexible and that we can start configuring extra things such as options to, conditionally branch out and have stages based on, well, actually, if it's being tagged with it needs sensitivity review or something, then we have the option to extend the process in a different way. But at the moment, it can't be modified and it can't be easily extended, which is a little bit frustrating. So you're probably wondering why I'm excited by this, because yes, I can see that this multi-stage concept is something that some organizations are already wanting and are probably delighted to see introduced. But for me, it's really not about the multi-stage. For me, I wouldn't call them multi-stage disposition. For me, I'd call this, the bit that I'm excited by is the fact that you've almost got the ability to delegate disposition for the very first time in Microsoft 365. So if you think about organizations, I think every organization who uses Microsoft 365 is a bit different. And I don't think many of them work in a way that a single central disposition review is that feasible or practical. I'm sure there are plenty of organizations where they can get away with having a single central group of records managers who are undertaking that disposition review process. I'm sure that works in some organizations, but let me give you some examples. Firstly, there's going to be large organizations where the records management team is too small, frankly too far away from the content, and they need to almost delegate the disposition review to, I don't know, different departments inside the organization, so that the local information managers or records managers undertake the review for that part of the organization, that department's records, let's say. Certainly there's other examples I come across all the time where there's less standard organization shapes inside a tenancy. You see, Microsoft almost assumes that there's a one-to-one relationship between an organization and a tenancy, and that each Microsoft 365 tenant only has one organization that owns and controls it. But actually, I will have so many organizations where that simply isn't the case, where let's say you've got a big private sector conglomerate of companies that are all, high street shops next to, I don't know, industrial companies that all happen to be owned by the same group, but don't actually have anything to do with one another. I've seen this in universities where there's multiple colleges that are all separate legal entities that are all inside the same tenancy. I've seen this in the public sector where there's different agencies, and I'm sure some of you on this call will probably be nodding your heads. It's different agencies all sharing the tenancy together. And of course, how do you then, using the old method of disposition review, how do you ever possibly have a single central team undertaking all of the disposition review when you've got multiple separate legal companies or organizations inside the same tenancy? Because whoever's undertaking that review would have in the past been able to see everyone's information, everyone's records. If you're given access to that review team, you were able to see every single item from every single part of Microsoft 365 that was subject to disposition review. And there was no way of splitting it or sort of subdividing it. So it wasn't particularly effective. But what we've got now with multi-stage disposition review is, as part of creating a stage, each stage can have a different group or different individual, I'd recommend groups, but different group of reviewers added to it. And those reviewers, that group of reviewers, can only see the items that the records that are currently waiting for them to review. They can't see records from anyone else's review, just the ones that are currently pending for them at their stage. And what this means is, almost, if we forget about stages for now, almost you can create an architecture where different reviewers can only see the relevant records that you want them to review by giving them different retention labels. So let me try and explain. You could almost, and I wouldn't suggest you'd recreate different file plans like this entirely, but you could almost create labels, an architecture of labels for each group of reviewers or each entity. So you can imagine each organization that happens to be in a tenancy might have their own group of labels, or each, if you want to delegate it inside an organization, you could imagine each department might have their own group of labels. And so long as you've got the processes to make sure that the workspaces, the teams, the SharePoint sites, etc., that are created for the relevant entity only get the relevant retention labels when they're first provisioned, you're in a situation where each of these different groups will have their own distinct group of reviewers. And then whenever an item comes up for review, the only people who will actually be able to see or review that item are the people who belong to the same entity as the entity that created that specific item. So it allows for the first time a really quite powerful way of introducing and delegating disposition review, which anyone who works in a complex organization, I think, is probably pretty happy to see introduced. The downside, of course, is you'll need to go back and start thinking about the architecture of your retention labels so that it works for delegating disposition review. Again, I can't see any questions, so I hope people can still hear me, otherwise I'm just talking to myself. But let's look at the last of these changes. In fact, just before I do, I'll just flick back for my own sanity just to see that I can still see. People are still, yes, you can certainly have the slides reference. I can still see comments, so I'm still hoping I'm live, which is good. So switching to the switch to using the preservation holds library in SharePoint. I don't actually know how many people on this call will even be aware of this, because to me, it was a little bit of a covert, hidden sort of change that was slipped in slightly under the radar. But it's quite a fundamental change. Let me try and explain. Anyone who's been using retention labels for the last 5 years, since they were first introduced, I think they were first called the data governance label or something back in 2016. is probably familiar with this error message because this has been a consistent 4 or 5 years now. This error message appears whenever a user attempts to delete a file that is subject to a retention label. Now, this error message, I'll be honest, you won't see it anymore. It's going or it's gone. An update that Microsoft released at the end of August has removed this error message from your tenancy. And to me, it's quite a big change and quite a significant change in the way that retention labels work. You see, up until this point, when the user hits delete, they would see this error message and the item, the record, would not be deleted. Now, many organizations sort of train staff to, when they saw this and they actually had a legitimate need to delete a record, that they would take the retention label off of that record so that they then could delete it and it would delete. But of course, now this error message won't show, so they won't be able to have that process. Instead, what will happen is retention labels are being moved to content that's subject to retention labels are being moved to the preservation hold library under the scenes in exactly the same way that retention policies have worked for years. This is quite a fundamental change, but it helps to bring, I guess, retention labels into alignment with retention policies. It's a much simpler story now when it comes to what happens when you hit delete. The answer is, if it's subject to retention, it will get taken to the preservation hold library for the duration of retention. This does, however, introduce concern around what happens if I actually want to delete that item. Imagine that, especially in scenarios where you've got, let's say, PII, and you're setting some form of default retention label on that library, let's say, I just think if people are in the habit of clicking delete and relying on that error message to remind them, oh yes, I've got to remove the retention label, I think they're probably still going to be in the habit of clicking delete and forget when the record disappears. I don't think many users will be thinking, hang on, should I have deleted that, or is that going to be caught in a hidden place behind the scenes that I can't see? So I'm a little bit nervous about this change, I'll be honest. Now, one thing I'll bring to your attention is I think this change has almost highlighted to me the importance of really thinking through your retention labels when you're creating them initially. I think if you think back to my bad wheat and chaff analogy at the beginning of this session, there's two primary purposes that we're creating retention labels for. One is to make sure that content is retained. And for that, you definitely want to make sure that you're applying a full retention label. But the other is to make sure that content isn't retained, to make sure it's deleted on a timely basis. And this setting that I've highlighted here, the ability to only delete items when they reach a certain age, I think for any retention label that you really are only applying to delete content on a timely basis, for example, a retention label called PII or one called ROT, you could imagine that this setting is probably really useful now, because if in the scenario that the user just hits delete, if you've previously ensured that the correct retention label is applied and let's say it's tagged as ROT or PII, it won't go to that preservation holds library. This setting will cause it to actually be deleted. But basically, it's not applying retention, it's just applying automated deletion at a certain point in the future. Now, it's not a perfect solution, I recognize, but it's a good practice to get into anyway, I think, to make sure you're only applying actual retention to the content that you actually want to retain. Which sort of led my thinking, and I'm hoping I've got enough time to go into this, led my thinking into thinking about the principles of retention in Microsoft 365. Because effectively, inside Microsoft 365, I'm sure many of you will be familiar, Microsoft has built this sequence of the principles of retention, where we've only got these rules apply to retention clashes, let's put it that way, when there's different retention that applies to the same item. Now, there's different scenarios that you've got inside Microsoft 365 where this can occur. But at a high level, you could have, let's say, both a retention label and at least one, maybe more, well, not necessarily at least one, but you can have one or more retention policies applied to the same record at the same time. So you can have multiple different sources for retention on the same item. which can get really confusing. And there's no nice, easy place yet, I hope it gets introduced, in the interface to say, just tell me what retention this item is currently subject to. So you almost have to work it out yourself, which I would suggest keeping it as clean, as simple as you can. But when there's different clashes in retention rules, these principles of retention are really important, because effectively each rule will sequentially sort of be applied to the records and determine how they're handled. Now, I'm part of the IRMS CAB with Maria Lim and various other people who are involved in that process. We're trying to sort of see if we can make suggestions to Microsoft to improve some of these capabilities. And one of the improvements I'd like to see introduced is more flexibility around these principles for retention, so that perhaps in some scenarios we can determine which retention is applied. And let me give you some examples of where I think they work and where they don't work so well. So, a couple of quick scenarios. The first one, imagine you've got, you're using OneDrive for Business, and let's say you just want to stop people from using it as a collaboration space. So you really want them to only be storing important, personal, relevant information there, and you really want them to be transferring anything they want to share or collaborate on into a more appropriate location, like in Teams or in SharePoint. You could easily have a situation where you set up a retention policy that automatically deletes down content on a timely basis, and you combine that perhaps with retention labels that allow users to override that retention. If you follow the principles of retention, what would happen here is that obviously, if the retention policy is trying to delete an item and the retention label is trying to retain an item, then the very first principle of retention would kick in and say, I'm going to let the retention label win, and this is going to work perfectly well, because effectively what you're doing is you've got a short retention and you're overriding it with a longer retention. That scenario works perfectly with the principles of retention. But if we flip this on its head and try a different scenario, let's say you've got a SharePoint site and it's got a default finance label, and that's keeping everything for 7 years, which I think is, or a default, I think I've written there, retention policy, and it keeps everything for 7 years. But in this scenario, you want to allow users to mark those items that perhaps contain credit card items with a quick 2-year auto-delete or 18-month auto-delete retention label. This, unfortunately, with the principles of retention, you could imagine coming down this path, the retention is going to win over the deletion again. So if you're trying to delete something after 18 months or 2 years in this case, the longer retention period is going to win. So you're in a situation where actually you can't allow this, this scenario doesn't work with the principles of retention. You can't have, you can override with a longer retention, but you can't override with shorter retention or shorter deletion. So the principles of retention, I think, are great in some scenarios, but they're not always what we're trying to achieve. So it can be quite frustrating, hence why I'd like to see more flexibility around them in the future. But just at a high level, I think they speak for themselves. Retention wins over deletion, makes perfect sense. Longest retention period wins. Again, you can imagine when you're trying to retain, when one item of retention is trying to keep something, let's say a policy or a label is trying to keep something for 7 years, and another's trying to keep it for 15, the longest will win in that scenario, and it will be retained for 15 years. This third one causes the most confusion, I would say, but it probably very rarely is applicable. At a high level, I wish it was almost written this way. Explicit wins over implicit means retention labels win over retention policies, because all retention labels in Microsoft 365 are considered to be explicit. Retention policies, however, there's almost a subtlety where there's almost a grading of retention policies. When you've associated a retention policy with a site, if you've done it explicitly and said just this site, then that would be considered explicit. However, if you've applied a retention label almost more generically, let's say through trainable classifiers or through any of the automated methods that I was talking about before, you're in a situation where the retention policy is almost implicit. So, but really the third rule means if it's a retention label, it's going to win. Some retention policies win out over others. And then, of course, if it ever, which I don't think it very often will ever do, falls into the fourth rule, then the most timely deletion will win. But it does lead to these quite frustrating scenarios. Anyway, I'm going to stop there because we're probably approaching time. I really hope this is actually legible and that people can hear me. But feel free, if anyone's got any questions, to reach out at any stage. Always happy to answer any questions anyone might have. I'm going to hand back over to Elizabeth and Sarah, and hopefully, I won't be able to hear, but hopefully I'll be able to pick up and take this forward.
Okay, thank you very much, Robert. That's been absolutely brilliant. Let me just... I'm just typing so that Robert can see.
Okay, I can see there's some questions in the questions tab, and
yep,
they're asking me to go and try and answer some of those questions. So I can see we've got 9 minutes left, and I really can't apologise that I can't hear anyone. But start at the top. So in example 2 on the slide, reads 7-year policy and 2-year labels. If it is a generic policy, would it be overwritten by Rule 3 explicit wins over implicit? So 7-year policy and 2-year labels. Well, the thing is that will only apply if it passes through the first 2 rules first. Effectively, what you've got is a situation where the very first rule that retention would win out. So if they're both retention, which I'm assuming they would be in this case, and neither's deletion, it will pass through the first rule, then it would get to the second rule, and effectively the 7-year retention would win out over the 2-year retention because the longest retention would win. So it wouldn't, in that scenario, get to the third rule. It would be kept for 7 years. Hope that answers the question. I forgot to start the live answer. Apologies. But do mention if it didn't answer your question. Right, second question. A general question. I'm very new to retention in Microsoft 365. Can you recommend training resources for an introduction to RM/retention in Microsoft 365? Well, there's lots of different training providers out there who can really dive into an awful lot of detail. And what you've got is, I'm hoping that Sarah or someone else can actually put this in the chat for me, but the RMS has a whole bunch of different partners, and our members can make use of those training partners to get really good sort of access to relevant information. I don't really want to name any particular partners, but I'm aware of one partner in particular who runs a really good course on retention in Microsoft 365, who you can look up on the RMS's training partners page. So someone can provide a link to that. I'd be really chuffed. Otherwise, if no one does, I'll try and find it myself in a bit. Hope that answers your question. Right, on to the next one. So, can retention policies or labels be applied to lists? I'm thinking of webinar registrations where the event details, presenter details, and participant details are stored as lists owned by the webinar organization. Can we apply a policy/label to force deletion of these after a certain amount of time? And the answer is yes. You can apply retention to pretty much all of the content in SharePoint, image libraries, calendars that happen to be in SharePoint, but certainly to lists. Effectively, the list that you're seeing, the list application in Microsoft 365, really fundamentally, it's storing those lists inside OneDrive or inside SharePoint, depending on how you've actually set them up. And so all of the retention that's applied into a standard SharePoint site or to OneDrive can be extended and applied, and is extended and applied by default if you're talking about retention policies that are associated with the given OneDrive account or the given SharePoint site, would automatically apply to that list. But lists can also support retention labels as well, so either or will work. There's actually a slightly interesting, subtle difference between the way that retention labels that are record labels, you know, the ones that make files immutable. Record labels, when they're applied to a document, will cause the document itself to become immutable, but the metadata associated with that document not to be immutable. So you can carry on as a user modifying the metadata, even though you can't modify the file. However, if you take the same record label and apply it to a list item in SharePoint, what happens is it will make the metadata immutable. So it's a confusing story. Just to complete that slight anecdote that I'm going off on a left field conversation about, the regulatory retention label, which is the quite bombastic locking permanently, no one can ever unlock it, retention label, makes both the metadata and the file fully immutable in both scenarios. Hope that answers your question as well. Right, got time for the next question. So, can the system show the reason for retaining information, such as the statutory instrument, and in some cases where the subsequent SI revokes or changes part of the information? Well, it's not quite tied in that well. I'd love it to be. You've got some abilities to sort of tag your retention labels, not your policies, unfortunately, with metadata in what Microsoft call a file plan, but it's not really a file plan. It's basically classifications that you can apply to sort of structure or organize your own retention. But I've not seen any way of tying it back into a statutory instrument or making it relevant in that case. So almost the justification for the application of retention isn't really hooked in yet. That's an interesting suggestion. It's certainly something that I think we should probably take forward with the IRMS CAB and see if Microsoft can actually give us an answer or suggestion, or even start thinking about it for their future roadmap. So I'll see if I can take that forward for you. Hopefully answered that one as well. We'll see. Right, can adaptive scope be used for other elements of Microsoft 365, for example, provision of access to a team? No is the simple answer. I've not seen, I think it's exclusively for retention policies. I've not seen it being able to be used in any other context. There's different options you've got when you're actually thinking about access to a team, but it obviously will depend upon how you set up the team, private, public, etc. Yeah, unfortunately, adaptive scopes are not a mechanism you can use for that at this stage. Next question. How does the retention label know when an event has occurred to trigger the retention rule? Does this require additional metadata or file structure? For example, when a building is sold, the file moves from one document library to another. Right, so this is the event-based retention. What happens with event-based retention is you classify the record both with the retention label that is subject to the event, and you also classify it with almost an ID as well. So let's say it happens to be the calendar year of the item, or let's say it happens to be the project ID or property ID or whatever it happens to be. Then what happens with event-based retention is you almost trigger the event against the ID. So you're saying, go and find me everything that's tagged with the retention label financial year end that's also been tagged with the ID of 2021, 2022. And then it won't find things that are tagged with 2022, 2023, or things that are tagged with 2020, 2021. It will just find the relevant sort of combination where it's the given retention label and also the given ID. And then it will invoke the application retention on that. Obviously, it could be a project ID. So just find me everything that's tagged with project closure that happens to have project ID 123, for example. And then it will apply, trigger the starter retention to all of those items that have that combination. So it does mean that you need to think very carefully about how you get that metadata onto your structures and onto your content. What I tend to recommend is that you have you use default retention labels and also default metadata settings. So wherever you can, let's say calendar year is a good example. Let's say all of your content has a standard content type across all of your SharePoint sites and Microsoft Teams. And what you do is you set a default of calendar year 2020, 2021 against all content. What you can, sure, users can override that if they want to. But what you've got is the ability potentially when the calendar year changes, both to trigger retention to start to apply, but also to update the default calendar year so that all of the content that goes in on the 1st of January gets tagged automatically with the next calendar year. So hopefully that will help answer that. I recognise we're at time and Elizabeth might be desperate to close. We've got 2 questions left. Elizabeth, I'll look at chat. Do I have time to close those or do you want me to stop talking now? See, typing. Do carry on. Okay, I'll carry on for a couple more minutes. So there might be new questions above. I might be doing this wrong, but anyway. Is there a way to delete content from the preservation library behind the scenes before the end of retention policy to meet legal need to remove data? I've actually started looking at that a little bit myself to see if I could work that out. There is no easy way of deleting items, because effectively what it does is it pops up a great big error message and says, you can't. This is subject to potentially, it actually said something like e-discovery, because of course the preservation holds library that retention makes use of was originally created for e-discovery cases. The way that it worked is effectively you'd set up an e-discovery case, and if a file was modified, it would automatically be moved. The copy before it was being modified would be moved to the preservation hold library so that it couldn't be deleted or changed for legal needs. So you can probably imagine there isn't a way that I found. There might be a way behind the scenes. There isn't a way that I found of actually being able to modify that, because it's specifically been designed to prevent you from doing that. You can download a copy, so you could always download a copy and reinstate it, but it wouldn't be removing that item that frustratingly is stuck there in the preservation holds library. So it is a bit of a pickle, I'll be honest. Next question. Is there any way to prohibit deletion at all, i.e. not just have something retained behind the scenes, but not allow deletion from the original location besides changing permissions? Yeah, it'd be lovely, wouldn't it? Obviously, you used to be able to do this with retention labels, with the popping up with the error message, but you can't really do this anymore because deletion happens. And the problem you've got is that stripping permissions doesn't really work either, because you say besides change permissions, there's big problems with removing, especially the delete permission from SharePoint. Because last time I looked, and again things change in Microsoft 365, so I might be talking wrong, but certainly about a year ago, last time I looked at this, if you remove the out-of-the-box delete permission from a user, it would actually prevent them from doing a whole bunch of other things. Specifically, the move and copy functions in Microsoft 365. When you're trying to move a file, it tried to delete it, so it wouldn't let you click the move button if you were trying to move a file from one place to another without you having the delete permission. But more importantly, again, this is last time I looked, when you created a new document and through the browser interface, and it opens up and it says document 1 at the top, because it's all in the browser tab. And of course, your instinct is to straight away rename that file. When you're going to rename that file, unfortunately, something about the renaming process, certainly last time I looked, was hooked onto the deletion permission as well. So it meant that you couldn't even rename your file. Now, that's quite frustrating as an answer, isn't it? What we did for one organization recently who had this exact sort of same issue is that you can't even intercept deletion. You can hear the deletion event, but you can't prevent it with code. So what we could do was we could hear things being deleted. We could automatically trigger a process whenever items were being deleted. And we could notify relevant local owners and say, look, someone's just deleted some things in this particular library. Are you sure that here's what they were called? It's up to you to review them and recover them if you want. Not ideal, but at least goes some way to preventing important information being lost in that way. It's probably not a perfect answer to your question, though. Right, I've missed a couple. There's still 3 answers at the beginning that I haven't looked at. So I'll start at the top. Will adaptive scopes, I should press start live answer, there we go. Will adaptive scopes allow me to apply a retention policy to lists with specific attributes, or not, because lists is just part of SharePoint? So retention policies can't be applied to lists, they apply to the whole site that the list is in. So you can't pick out attributes on a list or attributes on an item with a retention policy or an adaptive scope. The properties that I showed in that slide before are that you can pick up are all on the user, the Microsoft 365, or on the site. So you, unfortunately, you can't look at the list. You're just looking at the whole site that the list is contained within. So next question. how can you extract the expiration date from the compliance details panel to display as a column in metadata? Oh, I'd love it if this was, so this is an easy answer. So there is no API as of yet to get the expiration date out of Microsoft 365 that I've been able to find. The expiration date that you're seeing in the compliance details panel, I actually asked this pretty much same question to Roberto Iglesias in the compliance team couple of months ago now, and his response slightly shocked me because it was basically, yeah, the date, the whole of that panel, the compliance details panel, you might notice it looks a bit old-fashioned. It's a SharePoint 2010 branded panel, but some of the retention capabilities have been tagged onto the bottom. And specifically that expiration date, he inferred that it's not something to rely upon. So I'm not sure if the date is accurate in all scenarios, but it's not something I actually, probably about 6 months ago, before I asked the question to Microsoft, I actually asked one of my technical architects to actually go in, search through as you can imagine, Microsoft has tons of APIs, and try and actually find a way of getting to this. I don't think it's something that's there, unfortunately. It's something I'd love to see provided, because without it, it's really frustrating. If that was there, there would be a whole range of advanced features that could easily be brought in. For example, it would be really easy to build a report that showed you all of the items that are coming up for attention next week. You could use that date, but as it is, the best I can imagine is almost having to calculate that date, which is horrible when you start thinking through the technical complexity. Really wish I could give you a more positive, upbeat answer on that one. So I think this is the last one, I think. So given how flexible adaptive scopes are, how much of an audit trail is maintained on which scopes apply at any given time for an individual, as retention policies could vary as he/she moves from function to function? I don't know is the answer to the question. I've not seen the audit trail around adaptive scopes or how they're actually kicking in. So it's not ideal at this stage, is probably the best way of putting it. I'm hoping that we get some form of auditable log of this at some point in the future to allow us to see as people are moved in and out of a given sort of retention policy, or as sites are moved in and out through adaptive scopes. But I think at this stage in time, adaptive scopes are something that still, we don't know the full story. It got announced in May. I think it's still in preview. It's not hit any of my tenancies yet, at least to the best of my knowledge. I haven't even been able to discover the licensing for adaptive scopes. So one of you might know or might have seen it or come across it somewhere. But hopefully that answers the question. I think that's all the questions answered. So I'm going to shut up and let Elizabeth wrap up.
Thank you, Rob. We do need to finish now because Sarah needs to go off to another meeting. So I'd like to say thank you very much to Rob, and I will thank him formally because obviously he can't hear me in a little while. And I will check with Rob about publishing the recording. It does take a little bit of work to get the recording ready, so it won't be immediately, but we will let you know. So we'd just like to say that thank you very much to everybody for coming, and have a lovely afternoon, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next session, which will be December. So watch this space for the information about that. And for anyone who is going to be in Birmingham at the end of November at conference, we'll look forward to seeing you there. So thank you very much.